Welcome to those in the room and those online. Today's speaker is Jason Porter, another guest from the University of Edinburgh. This is not a coincidence because if I weren't at UCL, I would be wanting to work in Greek history at Edinburgh. It's an amazing centre of excellence, specifically in this in the field that we're interested in today as well. Jason actually came to Edinburgh, I gather from his academia profile from Nottingham, which is also a centre of excellence for similar things. Supervised by Steve Hopkinson and postdoctoral, which is a dynamic and green area, so we expect great things. But above all, and the reason I invited Jason is that he's been publishing, and there's a forthcoming monograph I didn't even get around to tell people when it's coming out. There's already published work in full articles on aspects of slavery, and one in particular from 2019, I think, in Mare Nostrum, which addresses the exact point that I made to introduce this series, which is that everyone's wildly excited about has been excited for a while about new institutional economics, but rarely applies that sort of approach to labour or takes into account the role of labour in the models that we're trying to build. And this is the exact focus of that article by Jason in Mare Nostrum. He's necessarily obliged to talk about the same stuff right now, but this is just to show he's absolutely working at the central interest of the whole series. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing more from him and hearing about his forthcoming monograph. And so, welcome, over to you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be a part of this very stimulating group of papers, which are often following with interest, certainly. And yeah, thank all of you for coming. In short, my paper today considers the decisions made by classical Athenians who wanted to acquire labor through Athens' system of slavery. And much of it is essentially a discussion of the rationale behind Athens' apparently extensive market for rented slaves, specifically at the level of individual decision-making. So, in part, I try to show that renting slaves was often used as a more affordable alternative to buying them. I also argue that renting slaves or otherwise agreeing to assume partial rights to a slave's person, what I mean by that, or to be clear, was in certain cases preferable to assuming the risks, liabilities, and difficulties of owning slaves outright. Yeah, I think there are situations in which it made sense to rent rather than buy slaves when both were sort of feasible options. I focus partially on Athens' very wealthiest, who dominate our evidence, but I also try to consider the strategies of what we would call, what we might call the middling strata of the city's households, who could buy slaves, but for whom it would signify a more significant investment. So the term strategies is a useful term for emphasizing the human agency behind historical action. Hence, its use in my title and in the paper in what follows. History is, I think, as much driven by individual responses to variegated circumstances as much as it is by cultural practices and norms. And this is a crucial point because it's often too easy, especially in sociology and historical narratives, to center history around society or community-wide institutions and practices. That runs the risk of generalizing or ignoring how cultural norms come about in the first place. So on that note, I want to acknowledge from the start that this paper tries to understand strategies around slave exploitation from the perspective of Athens slave owners, who viewed Athens' enslaved population predominantly as assets and resources. And obviously this is not a perspective that I agree with. However, by necessity, I sometimes adopt it for the sake of my argument, right? So I discuss, for example, the decreasing value of slaves over the course of their lives. And I understand if that makes people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable too, right? But I do think it's a necessary step in understanding Athenian society and its economy, right? In the words of Moses Finley, historical explanation is not identical with moral judgment. And I think also that this is an important topic because it can provide insight into the diverse experiences of slaves themselves. Slavery was a highly malleable institution in Athens, as in many other societies, and the strategies in which slaves were exploited had a considerable impact on their lives. So at the end of this talk, I want to discuss the impact of the strategies I'm discussing in this paper. I want to discuss the impact of them on the lives of slaves. So it's unequivocally true that slavery was highly pervasive in Athenian society. And putting aside academic arguments about its exact extent, the evidence very much suggests that those of Athens' families that could be considered affluent owned several slaves. And the labor to which enslaved persons were put was equally varied. And that will be evident from this talk. Also evident is the fact that many owners rented out their slaves to make a profit on their ownership. The literary evidence for this was collected by Perotti in the 1970s and has been recently discussed in Pauline Ismoit's book, La Cité et ses esclaves. Excuse my French accent. So if you look at number 1 on your handout, which is a valuation of an estate in an inheritance dispute, you can see an example of this, right? So in addition to real estate and various other valuable assets in this estate, this man Komon owned several slaves earning wages, andropera misloforundes. And the term has come to be used to describe a group of slaves rented out to another, though it might just be used descriptively here to capture the economic value of the slaves to the estate. In other instances of slaves being rented in Classical Athens, the rental was only temporary, often in the very short term, and only a part of the overall scheme for their exploitation, alongside their labor being more directly utilized for their owner's household. So for example, this is number 2 on your handout. The shabby profiteer, one of Theophrastus's characters, rents a slave out while he is away from Athens on business. There's also a passage from a forensic speech written by Demosthenes, which talks about a particular man's liability for his slaves while they are rented out to another, to demonstrate his ownership of them. The following section of this speech, this is number 3 on your handout, suggests they were involved in the sphere of agriculture as well, right? Agriculture was the largest sector of all pre-industrial economies, and Classical Athens was no exception in that regard. It seems very feasible that many slaves, like the Caradon mentioned here specifically, were involved in agriculture, and during the more lax periods of the agricultural year were rented out to others, right? And no doubt many slave owners also profited from renting out their slaves for the harvesting of various crops, when, again, the labor required on farms became much more intense. According to the old oligarch, as early as the 5th century, Athens' empire facilitated making profit from renting slaves to visitors of Athens, as you can see from number 4 in your handout. And it should be noted there's a disagreement about whether or not this is an authentically 5th century text, right? But it's still clear that almost certainly from the 5th century, at least, Athenians could profit from their slaves by renting them out. Also evident on the other side of the thing, so to speak, is that there was a demand for rented enslaved labor in Athens, from its residential population and not just from visitors. In part, at least, this was driven by a large market for temporary day laborers, as agricultural workers, porters of the Piraeus, and many other scenarios one can imagine. The uses of slave labor, as I've already mentioned, were various and not always concerned with monetary gain. So slaves bought for full-time personal service and domestic roles, for example, would be unequivocally an overall expense for the household, but an expense that almost certainly was considered a desirable one by the bulk of the Athenian families. And you can get a sense of this from the next example, which is, for our purposes, highly informative. This is number 5 on your handout, also from Theophrastus's characters, in which Theophrastus says, even though the stingy man's wife brought him a dowry, he doesn't buy her a slave girl, he rents one from the woman's market to go along when she leaves the house. So on the one hand, this is further evidence of enslaved rented day laborers, and the mention of a woman's market is really interesting here. It's also, however, a description of exactly the kind of choice I want to discuss. a decision to rent rather than buy an enslaved person when both were feasible options and made on financial grounds. A respectable husband would be expected to buy his wife her own attendant, but a stereotypically stingy man, according to Theophrastus, does not, but rather to maintain his public respectability, he'll rent one that accompanies her to market. This text, Theophrastus' characters, is a description of comic stock characters, and this decision made by the stingy man, as with his other cost-cutting measures, are comically exaggerated. One could fairly question if the women of wealthy families in particular ever went without their own enslaved attendant. But the same is not necessarily true about a poorer wife with only a moderate salary. Theophrastus' stingy man was probably not completely fictional, in my opinion, right? Considering the following observation from a study of the Brazilian city, Santos, in the 19th century, which is number 6 on your handout. Households that might not otherwise be able to buy a slave, a domestic servant, often opted to rent them. In a time when a single slave promoted the social standing of a family, the imagined perception by friends and neighbors may have been equally important as the work performed by a slave. And similar trends are observable in other urban centers of the New World. In Athens, at some level of household wealth, we might well presume that the cost of buying and maintaining an enslaved servant became, if not prohibitive of owning one, then enough to at least raise the question, how badly do we want one? Of course, there were families for which slave ownership was impossible, but as I hope to show later on, the possibility of borrowing money meant that whether or not an Athenian family could afford to buy a slave was in many cases subjective, or at least not exclusively a case of whether or not they had the money to hand. The sort of real-life person that Theophrastus based his character of a stingy man on, despite being well-to-do, might have expressed the decision not to buy a handmaiden for his wife as a matter of afford. Another motivation for the purchase of slaves in Athens that frequently represented an expense rather than an investment was to abuse them sexually. And this type of exploitation is in obvious ways very different to exploitation for domestic or agricultural labor, for example. However, the evidence for it is comparatively plentiful, and consequently it can give us a broad idea of how financial decisions resulted in different strategies to acquire rights to slave labor or person. Primarily, I want to focus on the circumstances in which a courtesan named Neaira was jointly bought by 2 men. And we know about this because of a speech preserved in the Corpus of Demosthenes, but written by Apollodorus, which provides a detailed narrative of Neaira's life as a slave, then as a freed sex worker, and eventually purportedly a legal wife of an Athenian man. Neaira is a fascinating and now a very well-studied figure from ancient Greece. And in this paper specifically, I want to focus on her early life as a slave. So what we know of Neaira's story begins with her purchase as a young girl in the city of Corinth by a madam named Nicorete, who specialized in providing high-class prostitutes to elite clients. From a very young age, she was rented out to various wealthy men, including some from Athens. Eventually, 2 Corinthian men bought her. Apollodorus describes the rationale behind this decision as followed. And this is number 8 in your handout, where these men, seeing that Nicorete was extravagant in the sum she exacted from them, for she demanded that they should supply the entire daily expenses of the household, paid down to Nicorete 30 minae as the price of Neaira's person, and purchased the girl outright. Though this particular example took place in Corinth, not Athens, it is important that Apollodorus was explaining this justification for Neaira's purchase to Athenian judges who must have understood its logic. The crucial here is that the decision was made on the basis of long-term financial considerations. That essentially, they considered that her purchase would be more cost-effective than paying a regular rent for her use. There are other accounts of Athenian men who rented slave prostitutes, not only for a sexual act, but for long periods of time, as well as examples proffered by Apollodorus regarding the famous clientele of Nicorete's business. Another possible example from Athenian oratory can be found in the 3rd speech of Lysias. This speech revolves around a conflict between 2 Athenian citizens over the services of an adolescent male prostitute, And I don't want to dwell on this example too much here because the status of the adolescent is disputed, but there are good reasons to think he was a slave, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if you've got questions on it. There's also an example in Menander's comedy Edinburgh, in which a man who's become estranged from his wife rents a slave from a pimp to live with him for the high price of 12 drachma a day. This is number 9 on your handout. As far as the price goes, again, it's probably comically exaggerated. Renting her at this price for a year would cost more than is paid for Neaira in total. Right? And her given price of 3,000 drachma makes her roughly 15 times more expensive than the usual price for a slave attested elsewhere. She, is portrayed as having been incredibly valuable. And there are reasons beyond financial ones that might have dictated whether or not men rented or bought sex slaves, as in these two examples, right? Married men, for example, seem to have kept their affairs as out of sight from their wives as they could. So a courtesan owned by a husband would be much harder to hide and to get good value out of. It was when they were getting married that Neaira's owners decided to allow her to buy her freedom. We should also, not assume that all slave prostitutes were for sale, right? Although there's by the pimps that had owned them, right? Although there's good reason to think that many were. So C.W. Marshall, in an essay, notes that an ancient pimp has two options on making a purchase. He can attempt to resell the woman at a profit, or attempt to recuperate his investment through a series of short-term contracts. And from the evidence of the Latin comedies of Terence and Plautus, which were adaptations of lost Athenian originals, Marshall shows that although some pimps rented slaves out, on balance, selling them appears to be, quote, the preferred business model of comic pimps, end quote. As Marshall makes clear, this may be dictated by literary conventions rather than Athenian reality. However, as he also points out, there are logical reasons for assuming that those who bought sex slaves to make a profit often prefer to sell them as quickly as possible. Chiefly, as in other historical examples of sexual slavery, the sexual value of slaves would have decreased rapidly as they grew out of their adolescence. Notice that when Neaira's Corinthian owners no longer wanted her, they allowed her to buy her freedom at 2/3 of what they had originally paid for her, rather than selling her on again. Apollodorus paints this as a magnanimous decision on their part, but one might fairly question if the pair would really have made more from selling her to a brothel. Indeed, the business model of Nicorete, such as it's described, further supports Marshall's argument. So as you can see from the end of 7 on the handout, Apollodorus tells us essentially that Nicorete bought and trained her girls and eventually sold them all. It seems to have been, as far as he understood it, an explicit part of the business model. Essentially, the purchase of a slave who was highly valued for his or her sexual attractiveness was a very bad long-term investment in comparison to other kinds of slaves. One other important consideration is this. The truth is that many Athenian men probably could not afford to put up the money for a sex slave outright, especially an expensive courtesan, right? But really have any hope of acquiring them. Like with domestic servants and attendants, renting might thus have been the only real way that it could gain them service. Nevertheless, for a household of moderate means, there are ways to make a purchase feasible, which can be observed in our evidence for sexual slavery at Athens. One such method was to agree to a joint purchase with another man, or potentially several, and this is attested in the case of Neaira, as we've seen. The arrangement between her joint owners was presumably how they came up with the money for her purchase, or how they helped justify its expense to themselves and their friends and family. It is also attested for the purchase of another courtesan in Athens, as you can see from number 10 on your handout. This passage also shows, and the speech as a whole shows, the major disadvantage to such an arrangement for its parties. The speech, Lysias 4, describes a dispute that became violent over who got to spend time with the courtesan. Just as a side note, her own involvement in aggravating this conflict, something we'll pick up on again later. Joint ownership is otherwise not really attested in Athens, one exception being the financing of a group of slaves that we'll discuss in a minute. But this could well be an accident of evidence. Fairly extensive joint ownership agreements are observable in records from Hellenistic Egypt, where slaves used for a variety of purposes. It's also important to note, as I alluded to earlier, that Athenians could borrow money to undertake the purchase of a slave. Take this example from the third speech of Hyperides. This is number 11 on the handout. The speech was written for a man who had bought the family and business of a young male slave whom he claims to have fallen in love with. The man was obviously wealthy, but even so, the hefty sum he agreed to pay forced him to take measures to come up with the liquid money for the sale, or at least that's how Hyperides had it tell it. So look in particular at the claim that you quote had been a nuisance to my friends. He borrowed money from his friends to come up with the money, basically. The speaker of Hyperides unwittingly accepted a number of almost incredibly high debts owed by the slaves he purchased, and took their venture to court as a consequence. His buyer's remorse is a good starting point, I think, to begin talking about the risk involved in purchasing a slave. The circumstances in this particular case were unusual in the extreme, one suspects, because few, if any, slaves had the capability to take on large debts. Nevertheless, the purchase of a slave bore many, much more common risks. Perhaps most obviously, the slave might die. Their purchaser might also, however, find that they were not as easy to control as he had assumed, and would, for example, need to be supervised constantly. The slave might run away and disappear forever, or take considerable effort and resources to recover. Or they might just make things difficult for their owner in smaller but meaningful ways. In the end, the Ira's owners all did very well out of their purchase of her. Negrete made a huge profit both on renting her and by selling her, while she was close to her most valuable. Manodorus and Eucrates, the men who bought her, got what they wanted too. Undoubtedly, Neaira's purchase was an expense for them, but a much less marked one than renting her long-term one thing. They had exclusive sexual right to her for years and managed to recoup all but 1/3 of their original investment. If the figure in Menander's Epitroppontis is any indication at all, they saved a great deal of money. Indeed, the fact that a slave owner could resell or allow a slave to purchase their freedom demonstrates how much more financially beneficial the decision to purchase a slave could be. Not to mention, as in Negretti's case, the possibility of increasing the slave's value could mean gaining an even greater return on that. Considering this, along with all the other reasons we've noted so far, it's not surprising that Athenian families bought slaves when they could, and even borrowed money to do so. But in so doing, they also took a risk. And joint ownership could mitigate the extent of that risk, and it could make the purchase more affordable, but it also offered less benefits and invited the possibility of conflict. Of course, we have nothing even remotely approaching the evidence to know how often sex slaves, or any other type of slave, was rented rather than purchased. What the description of Neaira's purchase suggests, however, is that a good degree of rational economic thought went into the decision to hire to rent slaves, or at least in cases such as this. In comparable circumstances where young men or bachelors spend a long time with a particular prostitute, they probably thought hard about how much they would continue to do so and what its cost would be relative to buying him or her outright. These decisions, I would argue, led to a number of different scenarios in which slaves were often owned by one person in their totality, or rights to their personal labor were divvied up between separate owners, or owners and renters. And similar conclusions can be gleaned from examples where the purchase of slaves was an investment meant to provide a monetary return, to which we will now turn. So, I'm going to focus primarily on Athens' wining industry, but beforehand I want to discuss some examples of more complex arrangements facilitating investment in and control over enslaved labor. The first comes from the first speech by Hyperides. This is number 12 on your handout. Quote, "Let me explain the kind of method which this man Ariston employs. He issues a summons against everyone he meets, accusing and prosecuting those who do not give him money, but letting go all who are willing to pay. He gives the money to Theomnestus, who takes it and buys slaves, providing Ariston with a livelihood, paying him an obol each day for each slave." So leaving aside the charge of sycophancy, The investment strategy described here is an interesting one. Through it, the accused Ariston supposedly made a quick and easy profit from his money. This looks very much like a rental agreement between him and the Nestus, with the added condition that the Nestus make the effort of acquiring the slaves rather than their purchaser. Clearly, the arrangement was good for the Nestus too. Without needing or risking any of his own capital, he was provided with labor he could profit from. However, again, with the description being not as detailed as we'd like, my guess is that he had no legal right of ownership over these slaves. And Ariston needed the Nestus too, or else he would have needed to spend time making his own slaves labor profitable himself, as well as buying them. Indeed, I think what this passage and the next one that we'll look at make clear is that one of the difficulties with purchasing slaves with assets is that the slave owner needed to be confident either that they could be sold on for greater profit or that their labor could be utilized to their benefit. In most cases, essentially, someone would need to supervise their labor. Masters could use trusted and privileged slaves to do that. There's plentiful evidence for enslaved supervisors in Athens, but without one they could trust, they had to seek other alternatives. So one was to let slaves work independently and return a rent to their masters, a strategy which is also well attested in Athens. But this method of exploitation carried particular risks for slave owners arising from the slave's independence of action, especially for newly purchased slaves or others who masters had little personal experience with. This would no doubt have appeared very risky. And so the other alternative was to depend on free residence. Free Athenians generally avoided long-term employment for another, so Ariston could not easily hire someone to manage this asset on a salary, for example. And it's for this reason, I think, that we find arrangements such as this in our evidence. So take, for example, the arrangement described in Demosthenes 37, which is number 13 on your handout. And this is between hitherto unknown parties. In this speech, the speaker and the business partner bought a silver smelting workshop, including its enslaved workers. The plaintiff in the case, named Pantaenetus, ran the operation and profited from it, and returned to the owners a set fee. He'd done so before they bought the mine, and his continuing to do so was presumably a condition of his purchase. Very much seems that way from the speech. In the passage on the handout, the arrangement is described as a lease, and it effectively functioned as one. However, as indicated by the final detail of this arrangement, the workshop was not straightforwardly rented to Pantaenetus, who had a right to reclaim the workshop as his own property by paying back its costs to its owners. Notice also that the person for whom the speaker and his partner, from whom the speaker and his partner bought the operation is said to have purchased them for Pantaenetus. Later in the speech, accusations lodged by Pantaenetus are recorded, and he refers to the workshop and the slaves as his. There's some complicated rhetoric in this speech, but effectively the purchase of this workshop by the speaker and his partner, like those who had owned it before, can be considered essentially a loan investment in Pantaenetus' business. The workshop and the slaves functioned essentially as security on that loan. So when Pantaenetus supposedly did not pay his rent, he claimed for reasons outside of his control, the entire property was seized by the speaker's business partner and the speaker's slave, who was presumably overseeing his interests. They took over the workshop, took its inventory, and stopped the slaves from working. Pantaenetus later sued them for this. And the speaker and his partner then sold their stake in the shop shortly after, though the circumstances in which the sale took place were contested by Pantaenetus and the speaker. But anyway, we noted previously the financial justification for selling specifically sex slaves on as quickly as possible, but that was driven specifically by the reasons for which they were bought and sold. One wonders the extent to which many slaves were rented long-term chiefly because their owners did not want to sell them. Nevertheless, the agreement for this particular smelting workshop was at least feasibly in the interest of all parties. Pantaenetus presumably needed or could not risk the capital to buy his workshop, and his investors had no interest in managing a smelting workshop themselves. Allowing him the right to purchase the workshop later may well have been a concession to Pantaenetus. It was quite feasibly also to his investors' advantage too, however. It gave their lessee a greater personal stake in the property, and it alleviated the risk of them being stuck with a property they did not want to manage, or of eventually being left holding slaves that had reached old age. Whatever the case, this arrangement speaks to the possibilities for Athenians to acquire finance for slave labor without having or risking their own capital to do so, which in this case at least, or with in this case at least, the possibility of eventually owning them. A similar example in this respect comes from the only fully extant speech of the orator Lycurgus. At one point in this speech, Lycurgus describes a group of slaves being bought essentially on credit. This is number 14 on the handout. Quote, Amyntas resold the slaves himself for 35 minas to Macares of Carne, who had married Leocrites' younger sister. Macares had no ready money for the purchase and so drew up an agreement which he lodged with Escipes and paid Amyntas interest of 1 mina. The interest he paid on this credit, 1 mina, or 1,000 drachma per month, was just over 34% per annum, which is an extortionate fee and far more than interest on other loans we know of in Athens. It's indicative of the kind of rate an Athenian might be willing to pay to gain ownership of valuable income-earning slaves. And it's all the more surprising because this was essentially a deal between in-laws. And just further on that point, that borrowing money more generally was not otherwise unheard of at Athens is indicated by the existence of officials tasked with overseeing claims on debts and loan agreements of a huge variety of kinds, as attested in the Athenian constitution by a student of Aristotle. This is number 15 on handout. Evidently, Athens' legal framework supported borrowing from friends, investors, and possibly also what we might call loan sharks to buy slaves, amongst other things. So one wonders in practice how different this purchase by Macares really was from the arrangement drawn up with Pantanitus. Like Pantanitus, Macares probably stood to forfeit his slaves if he could not keep the sum of repayment. The slaves were not fully his either way until he had paid for them. Unlike Pantanitus, he possibly took the risk of committing himself to paying back the full amount of the slaves and possibly offered other collateral. But we're not as well informed about the specifics of this arrangement. In tandem with the others we just discussed, however, it gives us a sense of the diverse ways in which capital could be attained to finance the purchase of slaves, particularly income-earning ones, one feels. So, having said that, let's move on to discuss mining. That slavery provided the vast bulk of labor for Athens' extensive silver mining throughout this classical period is a safe hypothesis for a number of reasons. And it's not really been contested as far as I'm aware. The passage of Xenophon's Poroi, his Ways and Means, claims that wealthy Athenians rented out thousands of mining slaves for operations. This is number 16 on your handout. Xenophon's recommendation for further exploitation of the mines to increase public revenue, which is the actual subject of this discussion here, is the purchase and renting out of thousands of enslaved miners by the Athenian state. And from this evidence, essentially alone, it has generally been thought that in the sphere of mining, many or most enslaved workers were rented. I think this conclusion is warranted and can be justified by the nature of mining in Athens and tentatively supported by inscriptions recording mining leases. The details of over 100 leases of mines from the mid to late 4th century BC have survived in the Polity records, which record certain sources of state income per year. The inscriptions list both the leasee, who was the person responsible for the payment to the state for use of the mine and presumably therefore the one carrying out the mining. As a means of locating mines and distinguishing them from one another, these records also record the owner of the land on which each mine was located, or the owners of bordering land in the mining region as well. So from studies of these leases, in particular earlier studies by Hopper, supported by studies investment patterns according to socioeconomic groups by scholars such as Osborne, Shipton, and Visa. The following important observations can be made about the strategies around Athens' mining district. In the vast majority of cases where the lessee and the owner or owners of the land on which the mine was located can be ascertained, they were different people, right? And neither is there any evidence to suggest that owners and lessees were related to each other. In other words, Athenians on the whole appear not to have prospected mines on their own land. Neither do these leases indicate mining was undertaken by a select group of experienced mining professionals. In fact, the lack of repeat leases for the same mine, when this exists in our evidence, and across Athens mining leases as a whole, suggests that the bulk of people that took out a lease for a mine did not stay in the business of mining after the expiration of the contract would stay. And if you look at the tables I copied from Visa's study, this is number 18 on your handout, you can also see both the low number of mine lessees who are known to have owned land in the region and to have come from its wealthy land citizens, right? Far more known wealthy individuals are listed as landowners rather than lessees. As Osborne correctly argued, this is probably a reflection of the fact that property owners, for the most part, prefer to rent silver-rich land to prospectors rather than trying to mine it themselves, rather. He further argues, probably correctly, that the landowners mentioned in inscriptions are the primary source of capital investment in the industry, and that includes slave mine workers. If this is right, it's almost certainly a facet of the unique risk involved in mining as a source of income. To discover a new silver vein underground in the first place, a single tunnel excavation process needing only a few hands would be necessary before, if a vein was discovered, additional manpower could be productively used to widen and expand the tunnel for ore extraction. Time this first process could take between several months to potentially over a year, depending on how deep the vein was. The depths of Athenian silver mining shafts range from 10 to 35 meters to sometimes, in a couple of exceptional cases, over 100 meters. Xenophon in his Poroi noted the particular financial risks involved with the opening of new mines. Right? And moreover, unlike a workshop, a store, or a farm, a silver mine could never be expected to provide a permanent source of income. It might take years for a silver vein to be exhausted depending on its size, but the exact size of a vein would have been initially unknown to the discoverers and could have varied widely. You can get a sense of how big they are when you discover it. But, yeah, again, Athenian mines range in total length from a couple hundred meters to several kilometers in certain cases. So even working a previously productive mine, in other words, had its risks and could never guarantee a lifetime's work for its laborers. And this can be supported from evidence elsewhere in history that indicates the extensive risks that mining entails as an enterprise. So bearing all this in mind, it's also important to note that the lease agreements with the Athenian state were for a fixed sum and a fixed duration of time. There was some uncertainty about how much they cost exactly, and also reason to think that in the very early stages of excavation, mines had to be registered but at no cost. But nevertheless, to take out a lease was a commitment to a financial expenditure for a period of time, even before we factor in the cost of labor, and that's without a sure guarantee of return or any real certainty of how much that return might be. Silver mining at Athens could obviously be extremely lucrative for the lucky, but it was also a highly risky venture. Also worth bearing in mind is the fact that at some point after the discovery of a highly productive silver vein, at which point the greatest amount of labor would be necessary for the mine, these costs could, probably on their renewal, apparently rise into the thousands of the drachma. Explanations for the inconsistency of these higher figures infer a degree of competition for leases, and this in turn suggests that the holders of Athenian mining leases could not be sure of repeated use of the mine that they worked in the future at a price they would find acceptable. And the point of all this is to show the circumstances in which a microeconomy in Athens, utilizing predominantly rented enslaved laborers, developed around silver mining. So firstly, mining with all its risk appears to be, for the most part, undertaken by non-elite Athenians who could probably not afford to buy slaves outright. However, as previous sources we looked at and others one could mention suggest, it's perfectly possible that these enterprises could be funded by financiers. More important to my mind was the risk of mining ventures and the relatively limited and unknown time in which a large degree of labour was required for them, in addition to a lack of certainty that such a workforce could be put to use again quickly. Renting enslaved mine workers for these reasons may have been a far more attractive option than buying them in many cases. And the fact that mining is very dangerous work, and we have good reason to believe that on average the lives of mining slaves would be quite short, and investment in buying them was even more risky. But neither should we assume that miners, again, potentially with the aid of investors, never bought their enslaved workers either. And again, the picture isn't completely simple, right? There are repeated names on the mining leases, and these frequently include miners who we know to have been wealthier. Right? So others may have taken the risk to buy slaves as a step towards becoming someone who rented them. One feels that a great deal of the extensive experience necessary to build and excavate mine shafts came from slaves. And so some of these were very skilled workmen in their own right and valuable investments in that sense. And so again, even in a very specific microeconomy such as this, where we have reason to think a great deal of slave labor was rented, there was probably a diversity of strategies, even if it tended in one direction. Before I end, I want to quickly discuss how different agreements over shared rights to slaves affected different experiences of enslavement. And to do so, I want to turn to a personal letter written by an enslaved boy or possibly man named Lessus, which is number 19 on your handout. And the letter reads, Lessus is sending this to Xenocles and his mother, asking that they by no means overlook that he's perishing in the foundry, but that they come to his masters and that they have something better found for him. For I have been handed over to a thoroughly wicked man. I'm perishing from being whipped. I'm tied up, treated like dirt, more and more. Edward Harris has rightly argued that Lessus was a slave, rented or possibly left to the foundry owner, the wicked man he mentions. The word translated as master's here, despotai, to whom Lessus hopes Xenocles and his mother will appeal, is otherwise used of human relationships only to refer to the master of a slave in Athens. Incidentally, the reference to multiple masters is interesting and maybe another piece of evidence for joint ownership, though it may also be referring to a husband and wife or father and son. This letter has received a great deal of attention since its publication 23 years ago. Not least of all, it is valuable as a description of enslavement in the words of a slave, which makes it a very rare ancient artifact. Scholars have pointed to the situation of Lessus as emblematic of certain features of slave status. So he's treated cruelly, he's subjected to restraint and physical abuse, he's separated from his mother, a facet of the fact that slaves had no legally recognized family, and he's ultimately dependent on the intervention of his owner rather than kin or law to improve his circumstances. And these are all important observations. But in fact, the particulars of Lessus's circumstances are obviously the outcome of the type of exploitation to which he was subjected as well. So for one thing, the renting out of slaves was likely to result in a more frequent separation from their family and friends, and others they may have formed relationships with in the household of their master. Furthermore, one wonders whether the treatment of rented slaves was frequently worse than the treatment by their master. Of course, abusive treatment of slaves is attested more generally, was probably quite common. But even considering the many irrational cruelties that slavery enabled, there is a fair argument to be made that masters' interest in their property prevented some of its excesses. Owners may well have had an interest in developing a relationship with the slave in certain cases, to use them in positions of responsibility as managers, supervisors, and agents. For a renter of a slave, there would be less long-term interest in their value as property, and as such, arguably there may have been less concern for causing an injury or maintaining the appearance of even a degree of fairness, right? And Lessus's letter anecdotally supports the suggestion, at least. On the other hand, renters might have been more cautious at points in their treatment of slaves because they were afraid of earning their owner's ire. And one suspects that masters who could personally justify their own excessively abusive treatment of their slaves by Athenian standards might be less willing to accept the same treatment on the part of renters. On this point, the fact that Lessus was able to appeal to another for protection at all makes the situation notably different from many slaves, I think. And of course, we have no idea how his master would have responded if he did. But in these particular circumstances, slaves had a weapon, limited though it may have been, to use against their exploiters. Recently, there's been a great deal of focus in ancient history on the agency of slaves, their human capacity to shape the world around them despite their bondage. Sarah Forsyth, for example, has recently argued that possible Athenian law which ordered the surrendering of slaves to cover damages they incurred could be used to the advantage of slaves, cooperating with the free persons against their masters. Plato was very concerned about law being used like this in his laws. Free Athenians with different and often competing interests in slaves would, one imagines, have offered more fertile possibilities for slaves to use these different interests for their own purposes. And at the very least, one cannot imagine that the dynamic between slaves and their masters was different to that between slaves and their renters, or even partial masters. There's some evidence beyond the letter of Lessus that I think we can use to very tentatively speculate about the suggestion. So consider the jointly owned courtesan from Lysias 4, who we discussed earlier. We told each of our owners what they wanted, different things, right, what each wanted to hear. And one cannot help but think that the developing rivalry between our owners was an excellent opportunity to get advantages for herself. Similarly, the slaves rented by Antenatus supposedly halted work when the slave of the man who part owned them showed up out of the blue to take control of the foundry. I doubt they would have had much communication with their technical owners beforehand or had any real sound knowledge about how justified the workshop takeover was. My own suspicion is, again, speculatively, is that they did not need much convincing, and who could blame them? So, in conclusion, it's evident that slaves were valuable to Athenians of all walks of life for a number of distinct reasons. In certain cases, Athenians could not buy the slaves they wanted outright, and so numerous options existed to facilitate their acquiring rights to enslaved labor. These options, each with their own disadvantages and risks, included agreements on joint purchase and ownership of other parties, as well as borrowing money from friends and investors, or buying slaves on credit. Renting slaves, moreover, was one important way of gaining slave labor when Athenians could not afford to buy it as well. In fact, I've argued that in certain cases, Athenians chose not to buy, but rather to rent enslaved laborers. And assessments of the comparative costs of and the risks involved in a purchase were key to these decisions. And they were often specific, moreover, to the function for which different slaves were required. So, as Ismar has noted, slaves in Athens were to a very significant extent considered financial assets as well as investments in labor social standing. Part of the value of this paper, I hope, is its ability to further demonstrate the complex and diverse economic strategies of Athens. Our discussion also suggests a good deal of economic rationality on the part of Athenians, and some important recent scholarship has shown that decisions were made with assessment of with sound assessment of return against cost and, in particular, risk. And I think this paper corroborates these studies. Finally, one thing that is also suggested is the particular experiences of slavery that the strategies we discussed today created, including, I think, the opportunity for slaves to use more complicated arrangements of their ownership to their advantage. And either way, thinking about the different forms that slave exploitation took in Athens can, in this way, shed light on the possible strategies of slaves as well as their masters. So, thank you.